He had no idea that a simple classroom humiliation would silence an entire room in seconds. If you enjoy stories about dignity, hidden strength, and unexpected justice, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Now, let's return to the moment inside Ridgewood High School, where everything was about to change for Emily Parker. In a quiet suburban high school classroom in Ohio, sunlight filtered through half-closed blinds, casting long golden lines across rows of desks where students sat restless, whispering under their breath as they waited for the next assignment. At the front of the room stood Mr. Daniel Carter, a teacher known for his strict standards and his belief that confidence was something students had to earn under pressure. Today, his attention was fixed on one person who rarely spoke unless spoken to, Emily Parker, a woman in her early 30s who had recently enrolled in a continuing education program while working part-time at a local bookstore. Emily kept her gaze lowered, hands folded neatly on her desk, as if she was trying not to take up more space than necessary. To her classmates, she was just another quiet adult learner trying to get through the course. But to Mr. Carter, she represented something he thought he could easily expose. He adjusted his stance, crossing his arms, scanning the room before letting his voice cut through the silence with deliberate precision. "Emily Parker," he said, as the classroom immediately shifted its attention toward her. You could feel the curiosity ripple through the students, subtle smiles forming as they wondered why she had been singled out. Mr. Carter walked slowly toward her desk, placing a printed sheet of paper in front of her without breaking eye contact for more than a second. "I want you to read this passage aloud," he said calmly, though there was an unmistakable edge in his tone that suggested more than a simple exercise. A few students exchanged glances, sensing that this was not just about reading practice, but about watching someone being placed under pressure. Emily hesitated for a brief moment, her fingers tightening slightly around the edges of the paper as she slowly stood up from her chair. The room seemed to grow quieter, as if even the air itself was waiting to see what would happen next. "Mr. Carter stepped back, giving her the floor, his expression unreadable but clearly expectant. Every student in the room was now focused on her, anticipating a mistake, a stutter, anything that would confirm their assumptions. Emily looked down at the text, took a slow breath, and began to read. Her voice was soft at first, barely rising above the hum of the classroom, as the first words left her lips, and the moment began to unfold in a way no one in that room could yet understand. But what started as a simple reading exercise was already shifting into something far more unexpected. Emily Parker continued reading, her eyes moving steadily across the printed page as the classroom settled into a strange kind of suspended attention where no one quite knew whether to expect failure or something else entirely. And Mr. Daniel Carter remained near the front of the room with his arms still crossed, watching her with the calm certainty of someone who believed he had already predicted how the moment would end. While a few students leaned back in their chairs, exchanging quiet looks that suggested mild amusement rather than genuine interest. But as Emily moved further into the passage, something subtle began to change in the way she held herself, her shoulders no longer appearing as tense as before, and her voice, though still soft, started to gain a steadier rhythm that made individual words land more clearly in the room. And it was not loud or dramatic at first, but there was a growing consistency in her pacing that caused a few students to look up from their desks, without fully understanding why they were suddenly paying closer attention. Mr. Carter noticed it too, but dismissed it internally as simple nervous adaptation, the kind of adjustment people make when trying not to embarrass themselves. Yet Emily's focus did not waver, and she continued, as though she had slipped into a space where the classroom noise no longer reached her. And as she reached the middle portion of the text, her tone shifted again, not in volume but in presence, as if the meaning behind the words was beginning to guide her delivery rather than the other way around. A quiet clarity forming in each sentence that made the room feel slightly smaller and more contained. One student in the second row stopped whispering to a classmate and turned fully toward her. Another slowly placed their pen down without realizing it, and the earlier amusement that had flickered across a few faces began to fade into uncertainty. Mr. Carter adjusted his stance and tilted his head just slightly, studying her with renewed attention as if trying to locate the point where things had started to deviate from his expectation. Emily's eyes briefly lifted from the page before returning to it. And in that small moment of contact with the room, there was something steady and composed in her expression that no longer matched the quiet image the class had assigned to her. She continued reading without hesitation, and now even the smallest details in her voice carried weight, every pause deliberate, every transition smooth, as though she had unconsciously aligned herself with the rhythm of the text in a way that made it difficult for anyone to look away. The classroom lighting seemed to soften the edges of the scene, the hum of the ventilation system becoming more noticeable as silence expanded between the students, and Mr. Carter, still standing at the front, felt a faint discomfort he could not immediately explain, not because anything had gone wrong, but because something was unfolding in a direction he had not prepared for. And Emily Parker kept reading, her voice now fully grounded in a quiet confidence that began to fill the space between every desk, drawing the attention of every person in the room one moment at a time. As Emily Parker continued reading, the atmosphere inside the classroom shifted in ways that were no longer subtle, because what had begun as a routine exercise was now becoming something that demanded full attention from everyone present. And the quiet confidence in her voice was slowly reshaping the way the room felt, as if the space itself was adjusting to a new kind of presence that no one had expected from her. While Mr. Daniel Carter remained at the front with his arms still crossed, though now his expression carried a faint tension that had not been there before. As he watched her more carefully, noticing how her pacing had stabilized into something steady and intentional rather than uncertain. And the students who had once leaned back in boredom were now sitting forward in their chairs without being prompted, their earlier amusement replaced by curiosity that they could not easily explain, because Emily's voice was no longer simply reading words off a page. It was carrying meaning in a way that seemed to settle into the room with increasing weight, and every sentence she delivered seemed to arrive with clarity that made it difficult to look away. While one student near the window quietly straightened their posture, as if realizing they had been slouching too long, and another stopped whispering entirely, turning their full attention toward the front of the room, and even the faint background sounds of the classroom, the shifting chairs and soft page turns, seemed to fade into the distance as her reading became the only consistent rhythm in the space. Mr. Carter shifted his weight slightly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction as he tried to maintain the same controlled detachment he had started with. But something in his observation had changed, because what he had expected to be a simple demonstration of hesitation had turned into something far more composed. And Emily Parker continued without interruption, her focus unwavering as her eyes moved smoothly across the text. And although she had once appeared hesitant and withdrawn, there was now a calm steadiness in the way she held herself that made her seem far more grounded than anyone had anticipated. And as she reached a particularly descriptive passage, her tone adjusted naturally, not dramatically, but with a subtle shift that gave the words a stronger presence in the room, causing several students to instinctively look at each other, as if confirming that they were all hearing the same thing, and the earlier assumptions that had been forming in the room began to dissolve without any clear moment of confrontation, replaced instead by a growing sense of attention that was almost unwilling, as if the room itself had been pulled into her rhythm, while Mr. Carter's gaze remained fixed on her, now less certain in its original judgment. And for the first time since she had begun reading, the silence in the classroom no longer felt like anticipation of failure, but instead like the beginning of something no one there was prepared to interrupt. And Emily Parker continued forward, steady and composed, as the balance of the room quietly started to shift around her as Emily Parker continued reading. The classroom had fully entered a state of quiet focus that no one had intentionally agreed upon. Yet everyone was now part of, because the shift in atmosphere had become undeniable, and even Mr. Daniel Carter, who had begun the exercise with complete confidence in his control of the situation, now stood in a more measured posture. His arms still crossed but his attention sharper, as if he was quietly recalibrating what he thought he knew about the person standing before him. While Emily's voice maintained a steady rhythm that no longer carried hesitation, moving through each line of text with a calm consistency that made the entire room feel increasingly attentive, and students who had initially treated the moment as an opportunity for mild amusement were now fully engaged without realizing when that transition had occurred. As the subtle authority in her reading continued to grow, not in volume but in clarity and presence, and every sentence seemed to settle more firmly into the silence of the room, as if the space itself was adjusting to accommodate her delivery, while a student in the back row slowly leaned forward, elbows now resting on the desk, eyes fixed on the front, and another student who had been previously distracted now sat completely still, as if unsure why they suddenly felt the need to listen more closely. Mr. Carter shifted his gaze slightly, watching Emily with a level of scrutiny that had replaced his earlier confidence, because what he was observing no longer aligned with the expectation he had set at the beginning of the exercise. And although he remained composed on the outside, there was a quiet sense of reassessment forming in his expression. As Emily Parker continued reading without interruption, her posture steady and composed, her eyes tracking the page with a focus that seemed increasingly natural rather than forced. And the earlier perception of her as uncertain or unremarkable had begun to fade within the room, replaced by something harder to define but impossible to ignore, as her voice carried through the classroom in a way that made even the smallest pauses feel intentional, drawing attention not through force but through consistency. And the students who had once exchanged subtle smiles were now entirely silent, their expressions neutral or thoughtful as they followed along, while the classroom environment itself seemed to settle into a deeper stillness, where even minor movements like shifting in a chair or turning a page felt amplified, and Mr. Carter's eyes narrowed slightly as he continued to observe her, noticing how the structure of her reading had become increasingly refined, with a natural flow that suggested familiarity with expression and tone far beyond what he had initially assumed. And although he still said nothing, his focus had fully shifted from evaluation to observation, as if he were trying to understand not just what was happening, but how it had become possible. While Emily Parker reached the midpoint of the passage and continued forward with the same steady confidence, and the room remained completely engaged, held together by the quiet momentum of her voice. As Emily Parker continued reading, the classroom had settled into a silence that felt almost intentional, as if every person inside the room had collectively agreed without speaking that this moment deserved full attention, while Mr. Daniel Carter remained at the front with a stillness that no longer carried the same certainty it had at the beginning of the exercise, because what he was witnessing was not aligning with the expectations he had formed. And although his posture remained composed, his focus had become more intense, tracking every subtle change in Emily's delivery as she moved through the text with a consistency that now felt deliberate and controlled. While students around the room sat completely engaged, their earlier restlessness replaced by a steady attention that none of them had been instructed to give. And Emily Parker continued reading with a calm presence that seemed to anchor the entire space, her voice maintaining a smooth rhythm that no longer fluctuated with hesitation, and instead carried a quiet assurance that made each sentence feel more grounded than the last, as if she had fully settled into the meaning of the passage rather than simply reading it aloud. And this shift did not happen abruptly, but unfolded gradually in a way that was difficult to pinpoint, yet impossible to ignore, because the classroom atmosphere itself had changed, with even the smallest background sounds fading into insignificance, while Mr. Carter's eyes remained fixed on her, now studying not just her performance, but the transformation that seemed to be unfolding in real time, as if he was trying to reconcile his initial assumption with what he was now observing. And Emily's expression remained steady and focused, her attention fully on the page as she continued without interruption, and the students who had once exchanged casual glances were now completely silent, their faces neutral and attentive, as though they were collectively aware that something important was happening even if they could not articulate what it was. And the room felt increasingly smaller in a way that made every word she spoke seem more concentrated, more present, and more impactful, while Mr. Carter subtly adjusted his stance again, his gaze narrowing slightly as he followed her progress through the passage, noticing how her pacing had become not only stable but naturally expressive, with pauses that seemed to emerge at the right moments without effort. And this precision gave her reading a clarity that began to shift the emotional weight of the room, causing even those who had been skeptical to remain still and focused. And Emily Parker continued forward with the same steady composure, her voice carrying through the silence like a consistent thread that held the entire classroom together. And at this point, the earlier assumptions about her had almost fully dissolved, replaced by a quiet recognition that whatever was unfolding was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. While Mr. Carter stood in observation, no longer simply overseeing an exercise, but silently reassessing everything he thought he understood about the person in front of him. As the room remained locked in attention, carried forward entirely by the calm strength of her reading as Emily Parker continued reading, the classroom had reached a level of silence that felt almost unnatural, not because it was forced, but because every person inside the room had become fully absorbed in the sound of her voice, while Mr. Daniel Carter remained at the front of the room with an expression that had gradually shifted from confident expectation to quiet scrutiny. As he followed each line she read with increasing attention, noticing that what he had initially framed as a simple exercise was now unfolding into something far more complex than he had anticipated. And Emily's voice carried through the room with a steady consistency that no longer showed any trace of hesitation, instead presenting a calm and controlled rhythm that made each sentence feel anchored and deliberate. While the students who had once displayed mild amusement were now sitting completely still, their earlier reactions replaced by a focused engagement that none of them seemed to consciously choose, as if the tone of her reading had gradually drawn them in without resistance, and the classroom environment itself felt different now, as even the smallest sounds like shifting chairs or faint breathing seemed more noticeable against the deepening silence. While Emily Parker continued without interruption, her posture steady and composed as she moved through the passage with a natural fluency that suggested not only comfort with the text, but a growing confidence in how she expressed it. And this shift was subtle enough that it did not announce itself loudly, but instead revealed itself through the steady alignment of her pacing, tone, and presence, which together created a sense of cohesion that held the room in place. And Mr. Carter's gaze remained fixed on her, now less certain in its original interpretation and more engaged in quiet observation, as though he were trying to understand how this transformation had emerged within a matter of minutes, while Emily reached a section of the text that required a slight adjustment in tone, and without hesitation she adapted naturally, her voice reflecting the meaning of the passage with a precision that caused several students to instinctively straighten in their seats, as if responding to an unspoken signal, and the earlier assumptions that had once surrounded her presence had now fully dissolved within the room, replaced by a quiet recognition that her reading carried a level of control that had not been expected at the beginning. While Mr. Carter subtly shifted his stance again, his attention now fully engaged not in judgment, but in analysis, as he followed her delivery with an intensity that reflected his growing uncertainty about the assumptions he had made earlier. And Emily Parker continued forward with unwavering focus, her voice maintaining a steady flow that seemed to guide the room's attention effortlessly. And by this point, the classroom no longer felt like a group observing a performance, but instead like a shared silence held together by the consistency of her reading, as every person remained locked in place, fully attentive to the presence she was quietly asserting through nothing more than words. As Emily Parker continued reading, the classroom had fully transformed into a space where silence no longer felt empty, but instead felt occupied, as if every student and even the air itself had been drawn into the steady rhythm of her voice, while Mr. Daniel Carter stood at the front of the room with a stillness that now carried a different meaning than before, because his earlier confidence had shifted into a quiet form of attention that suggested he was no longer simply supervising an exercise, but actively trying to understand what was unfolding in front of him. And Emily's reading remained steady and composed, her voice maintaining a natural clarity that seemed to carry through the entire room without effort. While the students sat in complete focus, their earlier restlessness now replaced by a collective stillness that none of them had been instructed to maintain. And this shift continued to deepen as she moved further into the passage, her pacing remaining consistent while her tone subtly reflected the structure and emotion of the text in a way that made each sentence feel purposeful. And Mr. Carter's eyes followed her closely, noticing how the delivery had developed into something more refined than what he had initially anticipated, not in a dramatic or sudden way, but through a gradual alignment of confidence, rhythm, and presence that made it increasingly difficult to dismiss. While a few students in the middle rows exchanged brief glances before quickly returning their attention to the front, as if acknowledging without words that something unusual was happening. And Emily Parker continued without pause, her posture steady and grounded, her focus entirely on the page, yet her voice now carrying a level of assurance that made the classroom feel more contained, as though the boundaries of the room had narrowed around her presence, and the earlier perception that she was simply a quiet or unremarkable participant had completely dissolved within the shared attention of the room, replaced by a growing awareness that her reading held a level of control that was becoming impossible to ignore. While Mr. Carter subtly adjusted his stance again, his expression now less about expectation and more about careful observation, as if he was silently reevaluating the assumptions he had formed at the beginning of the exercise. And Emily reached another section of the passage where the tone naturally shifted. And without hesitation, her delivery adapted smoothly, maintaining the same steady flow while reflecting the meaning of the text with increasing precision, which caused several students to become even more still, their attention now fully locked in without distraction, and the classroom atmosphere deepened into a sustained silence where even minor movements felt noticeable. While Mr. Carter continued to watch her closely, his focus no longer fixed on whether she would stumble or hesitate, but instead on how consistently she was maintaining this level of presence throughout the reading. And Emily Parker moved forward with the same calm control, her voice guiding the room into a shared focus that no longer felt accidental but fully established. As every person inside the classroom remained engaged in the unfolding moment without interruption as Emily Parker continued reading, the classroom had entered a state of complete attention that now felt sustained rather than temporary, as if the silence that filled the room had settled into place and no longer required effort to maintain. While Mr. Daniel Carter stood at the front with a composed posture that no longer carried the certainty he had shown earlier, because his focus had shifted into a quieter form of observation, where he was no longer simply evaluating performance, but instead trying to understand the transformation that had taken place in front of him. And Emily's voice remained steady and clear, moving through the passage with a consistency that made each word feel deliberate and fully formed. While the students sat in complete stillness, their attention no longer fluctuating, as even those who had once shown signs of distraction were now fully engaged without interruption, and the atmosphere in the room had become noticeably more concentrated, as if every sound and movement had been reduced to the background while her reading defined the space. And Mr. Carter's eyes remained fixed on her, tracking the way her delivery had stabilized into a rhythm that no longer reflected hesitation or uncertainty, but instead carried a calm assurance that seemed to extend through the entire classroom. And Emily Parker continued without pause, her posture unchanged, her focus entirely on the text, yet her voice now holding a level of control that made the room feel unified in its attention. And the earlier assumptions that had been present at the beginning of the exercise had fully disappeared, replaced by a silent acknowledgement among the students that what they were hearing required focus rather than judgment, while Mr. Carter subtly shifted his stance again, his expression now more restrained, as if he was carefully reconsidering the expectations he had set before the reading began, and Emily reached another section of the passage where the tone required slight variation. And without hesitation, she adjusted naturally, maintaining the same steady pace while shaping her delivery to match the meaning of the text, which caused the room to remain completely still, with students watching closely without speaking or moving. And even the smallest details of the environment seemed more pronounced against the depth of silence that had formed, while Mr. Carter continued to observe her closely, no longer expecting interruption or mistake, but instead focusing on the consistency of her presence and the ease with which she held the attention of every person in the room. And Emily Parker moved forward with the same calm control, her voice guiding the classroom through the passage as if the entire space had become aligned with her reading, and the moment extended in a steady flow where nothing broke the attention she had established. As every person remained fully engaged in the unfolding silence, as Emily Parker reached the final lines of the passage, the classroom had become so still that the silence itself felt like part of the reading, as if every person inside the room was now held in place by the steady presence of her voice, while Mr. Daniel Carter stood at the front with an expression that had fully shifted from expectation to focused observation, because what he was witnessing could no longer be explained by the assumptions he had made at the beginning of the exercise, and Emily's delivery remained consistent and controlled, her voice carrying through the room with a clarity that made the final sentences of the text feel especially grounded, while the students remained completely engaged, their attention locked in without distraction, as even the smallest movements had ceased, and the atmosphere in the classroom had reached a level of concentration where nothing seemed to interrupt the flow of her reading. And Mr. Carter's gaze followed her closely as she approached the end of the passage, noticing how her pacing remained steady and deliberate, with each word placed in a way that felt intentional and composed. And Emily Parker continued forward without hesitation, her posture unchanged, her focus entirely on the page. Yet her presence now felt fully established within the room, as if the entire classroom had aligned itself around her voice, and the earlier perception that she was simply a quiet or overlooked participant had been completely replaced by a silent recognition that her reading carried a level of control that had gradually taken over the space, while Mr. Carter subtly adjusted his stance one final time, his expression now quiet and measured as he observed the conclusion of the exercise. And as Emily reached the final sentence, her voice did not rise or fall dramatically, but instead maintained the same calm consistency that had defined her reading from the moment she began. And when the last word left her lips, there was no immediate reaction, only a pause that stretched through the room like a shared breath held in place, as every student remained still, processing what they had just heard, and Mr. Carter looked at her without speaking, his earlier certainty now replaced by a restrained silence of his own, while Emily Parker gently lowered the paper and returned to her seat with the same calm composure she had carried throughout the entire reading. And in that moment, the classroom remained quiet, not out of instruction, but out of a collective awareness that something had shifted in a way no one had expected. As the silence settled once more, deeper and more thoughtful than before.